You are listening to the Break Time Tech Talks podcast, a bite-sized tech podcast for busy developers, where we'll briefly cover technical topics, news snippets, and more in short time blocks. I'm your host, Jennifer Reif, an avid developer and problem solver with special interest in data, learning, and all things technology. Star Wars Day, or May the 4th, is approaching this weekend, and I am already definitely ready to geek out. There is so much content that has been published recently, so I'll try to hit a few highlights that I've dug in on just this week, but I have a ton of content tabs open that I still have yet to catch up on, so that'll probably percolate over the next several weeks' episodes. Plus, I've produced some content as well, so this will be an episode that is jam-packed with tidbits and threads for you to pull on. The first thing that I want to bring up this week is there will be a new Neo4j Graph Academy Java application course. I hinted at this a bit last week and said I would go into a bit more detail this week on it. It's going to be called Using Neo4j with Java. Hopefully it will be released in the next week or so. We'll kind of keep an eye on that. It should show as a coming soon course on Neo4j Graph Academy right now, but we'll see when we can get that live. It's an upcoming Java driver course. The goal for the course is just to show you the foundations of working with Neo4j and the Java driver, how to connect to Neo4j from Java, how to run queries, and handle the results that are coming back. Then once you would finish this course, you could go on to the full Java application course that would follow. That does need revamped right now. It is also on my to-do list, so hopefully I will have some updates to that in the next few weeks. But for the time being, this is a great start, just the Using Neo4j with Java course. It is a frameworkless app, so again, it's just using Neo4j and the vanilla Java driver, no framework involved. Shows you how to spin up the connection details, run queries, and so on, as I mentioned. This was a lot of fun. I worked with this course with another colleague of mine, and we collaborated on this effort. And through that, I learned a little bit more about the Java data type and Cypher data type mappings for things like temporal types, spatial types, and some error handling as well. I really enjoyed digging just a little bit deeper. As I've done development over the last few years, I've focused mostly on the Spring ecosystem, which has been pretty cool, but there are a lot of things that Spring does out of the box. So I really thought this was neat to look specifically at just the plain Java driver and explore some very Java-centric things, and maybe help me understand some Spring things that they're doing under the hood, as well as maybe explore possibilities with other applications and frameworks and so on down the road. I really enjoyed this, learned a lot more about how Neo4j and Java interact with one another, how you would use just the Java driver for connecting to a database such as Neo4j. So I'm really excited to see this come out in the next week or so. Keep an eye out for that. It is a very short form course. I think it's only going to be about an hour, so very easy to get up and running. If you just want to look at an introduction for working with Java and Neo4j, this would be a great starting point. The next thing I wanted to talk about is I mentioned a few weeks ago that I had played around with Neo4j's APOC, Awesome Procedures on Cypher. It's a utility library for Neo4j that extends Neo4j's functionality, but APOC provides some procedures for connecting to Pinecone, which is a vector database. I had said I had had some trouble trying to figure out how to connect to Pinecone using APOC and run some of the functionality that should be available there. And so I pulled down the repository a few days ago and started figuring out how I could create a pull request for updating the functionality for some of the API changes that Pinecone has made in the last couple of months, and started playing around with it, and actually realized when I dug into the code for APOC that there's not functionality missing. It's actually all there, but the configuration was kind of hidden. Just like it took me a while to figure out how to format the headers key configuration for specifying the API key as a request header, you can actually add all the required fields for Pinecone's index spec in the configuration as well. Again, the documentation doesn't make this super clear, and right now it says something like optional config, which actually, depending on the Pinecone procedure you're using, it's not optional, right? There are certain things that are required depending on the procedure, and Pinecone, at least right now that I can find, I haven't been able to get the host key first parameter working by using the Pinecone hostname, but I just end up leaving that null and then specifying the API key in the header. And of course, right now, when you do that, you have to specify the API key so it knows where to connect. And so that is a required config at this point. Same thing would be if you're trying to create a new index, you need to specify, first of all, whether it's a serverless index or a pod index, and then some of the details that go along with each one of those. Again, that would not be optional as well, depending on what you're doing. It's just, it wasn't clear how to specify some of the config. And I'm unable to get that host key as the first param, but I may just be doing something wrong. According to docs and other people I've talked to, that host Pinecone URL should work as the first parameter, and for some reason it's not for me. I'm hoping I'm just doing something wrong, and I'll figure that out soon. I will hopefully submit a PR though on some of the documentation and examples maybe in the near future. Then I have some content as well that I got released this week. The first was I had submitted last week an intro to retrieval augmented generation part 1, talking about a few things, a few concepts of the generative AI landscape. This week, I published part 2, which goes and stacks a few more concepts on top of what we talked about in part 1. And I talk a little bit about generative AI as layers. I've started thinking of Gen AI as layers, and I kind of like that analogy. We talk about vector RAG, then graph RAG, agents, and then MCP. I talk about what each is and when they're beneficial, when you should use one over the other, and so on, just to kind of get you started. Again, covering a lot of these foundational concepts and then providing external links where you can go to learn more information or build some of that knowledge on your own elsewhere. Then I also had a guest appearance on Neo4j Live, which is Neo4j's live stream that occurs every so often. And I talked about my ebook that I released late last year, which is called Developer's Guide: How to Build a Knowledge Graph. And that is available as a free downloadable resource, but I talked a little bit about it on the live stream. I walk through the Knowledge Graph ebook in this session, a little bit about the tools, how to build a graph and a knowledge graph, what the differences are there, show the repository links for where to pull in and import data. There's also a couple of screens that have changed in the Aura console for Neo4j that show up differently than the screenshots shown in the book. So I talk a little bit about the changes that have been made in the UI, as well as the tools and tips and tricks, and answer some live questions as well. So if you're interested in that, I'll link the YouTube video as well as the downloadable ebook. Now we can spin on to the content section. Again, I have tons of tabs of content open, but these were the two things that I focused on reading and catching up on this week. The first is a blog series produced by Mark Heckler on AI-generated content. What happened here is there are two code repositories. One is a blog generator AI, and the other is a blog editor AI. There's some resources and prompts outlined in each one of these, but the blog generator takes a prompt input as well as a particular topic and some guidelines and requirements for the content it needs to produce. And then it produces a piece of content, a short blog on that topic, and sends it over to the editor service, the other code repository, if you will. And the blog editor AI has some requirements and a prompt and resources that have been outlined by the developer, and then takes the blog generated content and edits it or analyzes it and approves or rejects the content, and then submits some suggestions back. And there's a few iterations that happen there, replicating a writer editor that we use in the human world, where somebody would write a piece of content, then an editor would review it and send back comments. Then the writer would take those and create a revision and send that back to the editor, and the editor might have a few more additions and revisions to be made, and so on. And that's exactly what these AIs are doing in this particular blog series. The content is published on Mark Heckler's blog and shows and very clearly says this is AI generated content, but shows the output of what the writer and editor came up with at the end, as well as whether it was finally approved or rejected after so many iterations. So a series of max iterations, didn't let it go on for like 20 or 50 revisions. It was only, I think, 3 or 4 or something like that. And most of the blog posts also include some developer notes by Mark on just his thoughts and opinions and interpretation of the content that was produced on the other side. This I found was a really interesting experiment on AI generated content and feedback. So using an AI to generate content and then using another AI to evaluate and revise that content. two separate AIs working in tandem here. I thought this was really interesting. There's, I think now 15 blog posts that are published to that site. So if you want to check that out, as well as the code repositories that go along with that, I will link to everything in the description. Then the second piece of content, and the last one for today, is that in researching for my Intro to Retrieval Augmented Generation blog post part 2 that I did this week, I looked a little bit at Michael Hunger's blog post on MCP. It's called Everything a Developer Needs to Know About the Model Context Protocol, or MCP. MCP launched late last fall and took the generative AI market and caught it up in a whirlwind, that is for sure. But I really loved Michael Hunger's take on just the overall sphere of what's going on with MCP, what it is, how to think of it, the benefits of it, why it has kind of taken the world by storm. It's a new standardization for working with AI applications and LLMs. Shows some examples and diagrams of architectures, some examples of servers and resources, plus some MCP integrations that Michael and the team have built as well. And then also talks about some of the limitations or considerations that you need to think of with MCP as it stands right now in the industry. Then finally, the blog post wraps up with plenty of third-party resources for getting started with MCP. So whether you're looking for vendor perspectives on MCP, or maybe some integration examples, or you want to look at other people's thoughts and perspectives on the introduction, what MCP is, you can look at a few different options there. There's a video format, there's somebody else explaining MCP, and so on. So lots of options there if you just need a place to kind of formulate your thoughts on MCP and get an idea for what it is. I thought this blog post was extremely thorough and very, very helpful, and formulated the content in my Intro to RAG Part 2 blog post as well. I will link that. I thought Michael Hunger's post here on MCP was fantastic. This episode, I gave some details about the soon-to-be-released Using Neo4j with Java online Graph Academy course, some updates on adventures with using Neo4j APOC to connect to the Pinecone vector database, and published my second part of the Intro to RAG blog series. Next, we talked content with an interesting AI-generated and edited blog series by Mark Heckler, and a fantastic overview of MCP by Michael Hunger. Thanks for listening to this week's Fire Hose of Information, and may the 4th be with you.